The morning everything changed, Cillian Doyle was standing in the lobby of a building he had never been allowed to enter, even though his name was on the deed. He was 43 years old. He wore the same gray jacket he'd worn to every school meeting, every parent-teacher night, every small appointment that mattered. In one hand he held a manila folder, thick with paperwork that nobody had asked him to bring. In the other hand, he held the hand of his daughter, Ren. She was 7. She had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of going very quiet when something felt wrong. The lobby of Doyle Hartwell Construction's head office in downtown Calgary smelled like polished stone and recycled air. The receptionist behind the curved desk looked up at Cillian, the way people look at someone who has come to the wrong floor. She smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't involve the eyes, and asked if he had an appointment. He told her who he was. She typed something, then typed it again. Then asked him to take a seat. He sat. Ren sat beside him, her small boots not quite reaching the floor, her stuffed bear, which she had named Hazel, tucked under one arm. She looked at the people moving through the lobby in their pressed suits and their lanyards and their flat expressions, and she asked her father very quietly if they were going to be waiting a long time. He told her he didn't think so. He was wrong. Cillian had started Doyle Hartwell 11 years earlier in a rented garage in Red Deer, with a second-hand drafting table and one commercial contract, a small warehouse extension for a trucking company run by his uncle. He wasn't a man who talked about himself easily, and he wasn't someone who mistook paperwork for power. What he understood was materials and margins and the way a building had to be honest with the land it stood on. He had grown up watching his father pour concrete for other men's foundations, and he had decided, somewhere around the age of 12, that he would pour his own. His wife, Catherine, had believed in that decision before he did. She had kept the books in the early years, working evenings at the kitchen table after their daughter was born. And she had been the one to suggest the name, Doyle Hartwell, her maiden name, folded into his. "We're building something together," she said. "It should carry both of us." Catherine died of an aggressive cancer 3 years ago. It took 8 months from diagnosis to the end, which was not enough time for anything, not enough time to prepare, not enough time to say everything, not enough time for Ren to understand why her mother kept falling asleep in the middle of sentences. Cillian had taken 6 weeks off from the company. When he came back, he found that the executive team had not been idle. He had hired Preston Hale as chief operating officer 2 years before Catherine got sick. Preston was 48, smooth-voiced, good in a boardroom, and had come with strong references from a firm in Vancouver that had since quietly dissolved. Cillian had liked him because Preston didn't perform confidence. He seemed to simply have it, the way some men carry a resting certainty that the world will arrange itself in their favor. Cillian had trusted that certainty. That was the first mistake. The second was taking his eye off the company during those 8 months. By the time Cillian returned, Preston had restructured the executive reporting lines, brought in 2 new directors he described as growth-focused, and had begun what he called preliminary conversations with a development firm out of Toronto called Meridian Peak Capital. He framed this to Cillian as opportunity. He used words like alignment and strategic positioning and runway. Cillian, who was still driving Ren to grief counseling twice a week and making lunches the night before because mornings were difficult, had nodded and signed where he was told to sign and trusted that the man he paid to run the operations was running them in the right direction. That was the third mistake, and it was the one that would cost him nearly everything. The lobby receptionist called over to Cillian at 11:17 to let him know that the executive floor was currently in a scheduled all-hands meeting, and that someone would be down to collect him shortly. She said this with the careful neutrality of someone who had been told to say exactly that, and nothing more. Ren looked up from the small notebook she'd been drawing in. She was filling the page with careful sketches of the lobby's ceiling lights, which she found interesting, and asked if shortly meant soon. Cillian told her it was supposed to. He had asked Preston's assistant 3 weeks ago to schedule him a seat at this meeting. The meeting had been moved twice, then confirmed, then moved again to today. Cillian had driven 4 hours from the acreage outside Okotoks, where he and Wren had been living since he sold the Calgary house after Catherine died. He had not told anyone he was bringing Wren because he had not imagined it would matter. The meeting was at the head office of his own company. He owned 54% of it. At 11:45, a young man in a blue lanyard came down and introduced himself as Connor and said he worked for Preston's office and that unfortunately the meeting was running over and they were deep in a sensitive discussion and it might be better if Cillian rescheduled. Cillian looked at the young man for a moment. He said, as evenly as he could manage, that he had driven 4 hours. He said that the meeting had already been moved twice. He said that he was the majority shareholder and founding partner of this company, and that he would like to go upstairs. Connor looked pained. He said he understood. He said he would pass that along. Wren watched this exchange without comment. When Connor left, she put her hand on her father's arm and said, very quietly, "Are they not letting us in?" Cillian looked at his daughter. He thought about what the right answer was. He decided the right answer was the honest one. "Not yet." "And," he said. "Why?" He thought about it again. "I think they forgot that it's our building." Wren considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "That seems like a big thing to forget," she said. It was. What Cillian did not know, sitting in that lobby, was that the meeting happening on the 14th floor was not an all-hands review. It was a closing session, the final stage of a transaction that Preston Hale had been quietly engineering for 16 months. Preston had been in contact with Meridian Peak Capital since the month after Catherine's funeral. The initial conversations had been exploratory, the kind that could always be described later as early-stage discussions if anyone asked. But by the following spring, those discussions had become a term sheet, and by summer there was a draft purchase agreement, one that valued Doyle Hartwell Construction at a figure significantly below market, structured in a way that would pay out senior executives through retention bonuses, while the founder's equity was diluted through a series of share reclassifications buried in a 40-page appendix. Preston had brought in 2 people to make this work. The first was Rosalind Vance, a corporate attorney from a mid-sized firm in Edmonton, who had drafted the share reclassification language, and whose billing records, if anyone looked carefully, would show that her retainer had been paid not by Doyle Hartwell, but by a numbered company registered in New Brunswick. The second was Kevin Drummond, the company's chief financial officer, who had been with the company for 4 years and who had, in the past 18 months, quietly altered 3 sets of quarterly projections to make Doyle Hartwell appear less profitable than it was, reducing the apparent valuation and making the Meridian Peak offer look reasonable. What Cillian had been signing in those early months after Catherine died were not routine operational documents. Some of them were, but 3 of them were not. His signature appeared on 2 amendment forms that modified the shareholder rights provisions in the company's founding agreement, and on 1 document that waived his right to first refusal on secondary share transfers. He had not read them carefully. He had been sitting with his daughter in a hospital 3 days before Catherine died, and Preston had driven out to him with a folder and said these were routine and time-sensitive, and Cillian had believed him. That waiver and those amendments were the skeleton of the transaction happening on the 14th floor. Cillian did not know any of this yet, but he was beginning to suspect some of it. The folder in his hand was the reason. 6 weeks before this morning, he had received an email. The sender was listed only as a series of letters and numbers, a throwaway address, obviously, and the message was 3 sentences long. It said that there were documents in the company's legal files that had been altered. It said that his signature appeared on agreements he had not been given the chance to review properly. It said, "Look at the shareholder amendment dated March of last year and ask someone you trust outside the company to explain what it does." Cillian had almost deleted it. He received periodic strange emails, and he had learned not to engage with them. But something in the phrasing, the specific date, the specificity of someone you trust outside the company, made him pause. He forwarded it to his personal email and sat on it for 4 days. Then he called his cousin Fergus, who was a commercial real estate lawyer in Lethbridge, and who owed Cillian a considerable favor from a land dispute 5 years earlier. Fergus had driven up on a Saturday. They sat at the kitchen table with the founding agreement and the amendments printed out while Wren watched a movie in the next room. Fergus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in the careful tone of a man choosing his words, that whoever had drafted these amendments had done something very specific. The shareholder voting rights for certain transaction types, mergers, asset sales, company restructurings, had been quietly reclassified so that Cillian's votes in those categories now required a 60% threshold to carry rather than a simple majority. Combined with the waiver of first refusal, it meant that a sale of the company could proceed if Preston and the board voted for it, even over Cillian's objection. Cillian asked if that was legal. Fergus said it depended on whether the signature was given with full disclosure. It had not been. Fergus spent the following 3 weeks reviewing documents. He brought in a forensic accountant from Calgary, named Dr. Amara Osei, who specialized in commercial disputes and who, within a week, had identified the pattern in Kevin Drummond's altered projections. The numbers had been adjusted with care, small enough in each quarter not to trigger an audit flag, but cumulative enough to shift the apparent trajectory of the company's profitability. Dr. Osei printed her findings on 12 pages of clean graphs and plain language, and Cillian had added those pages to his folder. He had also, quietly, spent 2 of those weeks consulting with a senior partner at a national law firm in Calgary about what options existed if a majority shareholder's consent to a corporate transaction had been obtained through incomplete disclosure. The answer was detailed and took nearly 3 hours to work through. The short version was, if the procedural irregularities could be documented, the transaction could be challenged and potentially voided. And there was a provision in the original founding agreement, one that predated the amendments, and that the amendments had not fully superseded, that required the personal written consent of the founding shareholder for any transaction that resulted in a change of control. Preston's team had missed it. It was a single clause on page 31 of an agreement drafted 11 years ago in a Red Deer garage, and it had been overlooked. Cillian had read that clause 4 times. Then, he had driven to Calgary with his daughter and his folder. At 12:19, a different person came down to the lobby. She introduced herself as Pauline and said she was Preston's executive assistant. She was somewhere in her 50s, wore her hair pulled back severely, and had the expression of someone who had been sent to manage a situation she found faintly embarrassing. She told Cillian that the meeting was concluding and that Preston would be available to see him in approximately 30 minutes. She asked if he could wait. Cillian said he had been waiting for 2 hours. Pauline said she was very sorry for the delay. Cillian asked what the meeting was about. There was a pause, barely noticeable, but there. Pauline said it was an executive strategy session and that she didn't have the details. Wren had fallen asleep against her father's shoulder, Hazel the bear tucked under her chin. Pauline glanced at the sleeping child and something moved across her face. Not pity exactly, but the involuntary softening that happens when an adult suddenly remembers that situations have consequences beyond themselves. Cillian kept his voice level. He said, "I'd like to go upstairs now. Not in 30 minutes. Pauline looked at him for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I'll go back up and let them know." She went back up. She did not come back. At 12:41, Cillian stood. He woke Wren gently and told her they were going up. He picked up his folder. He walked to the elevator bank and pressed 14. The receptionist at the main desk made a small movement as if she was about to say something. She didn't. The 14th floor was a long corridor of glass-walled meeting rooms and private offices. Cillian had been there twice before, both times briefly. He found the largest meeting room at the far end by following the voices. He did not knock. Preston Hale was at the head of a long table. There were 11 people in the room. Kevin Drummond, Rosalind Vance, 2 directors whose names Cillian knew from signature pages but had never met in person, and several faces he didn't recognize, one of whom was almost certainly a Meridian Peak representative. But there was a presentation visible on the screen behind Preston, the final page of a slide deck that read, "Tachmashins closing, pending approval." The room went quiet in the particular way of rooms where something is caught in the act. Preston recovered first. He smiled the smile of a man who has practiced managing surprises and said that this was unexpected, that they were in a sensitive stage of discussion, that perhaps Cillian could give them 30 minutes to wrap, and then they'd all sit down together. Cillian set his folder on the table. He said, "I want to understand what's being approved." One of the Meridian Peak representatives, a man in his 40s with silver temples and the confident posture of someone accustomed to every room receiving him warmly, leaned forward and introduced himself as the firm's senior acquisition director. He said it was a pleasure. He said they were very excited about the future of Doyle Hartwell under the new structure. Cillian said, "There is no new structure." Preston said, still very calmly, that Cillian might not have the full picture, that the transaction had been properly structured and reviewed, that the shareholder amendments had been signed. Cillian opened the folder. He placed Dr. Ose's 12-page financial analysis on the table. He placed the forensic comparison of the altered projections beside it. He placed the legal opinion from the national firm's senior partner on top of those. And then, at the bottom, he placed a single printed page. The original founding agreement, with Clause 31 highlighted in yellow. He said, "Clause 31 of the original founding agreement requires my personal written consent for any change of control transaction." That clause was not amended because the amendments were drafted around the voting rights provisions and did not reference it. I did not give that consent. I was not asked for it. The room was quiet. He looked at Rosalind Vance, who had drafted the amendments. She was looking at the highlighted clause with an expression that had gone very still. He looked at Kevin Drummond, who was looking at the financial analysis and had developed a slight gray cast to his face. He looked at Preston Hale. He said, "The transaction is void, and I think we need to talk about how these projections were altered and who authorized it." What followed was not a clean moment. Clean moments belong to films. What actually happened was a long afternoon of phone calls and raised voices and a conference room that felt increasingly airless. Rosalind Vance called her firm. The Meridian Peak representatives called their legal counsel. Preston attempted, for a period of about 40 minutes, to argue that the clause had been superseded by the amendments by implication. The national firm's partner, who joined by phone, explained in patient, thorough language exactly why that argument did not hold. Wren spent that afternoon in Pauline's office, eating crackers from a bag Pauline produced from a desk drawer, drawing pictures in her notebook, occasionally wandering out into the corridor to check on her father through the glass wall of the conference room. Once, she knocked on the glass and held up a drawing. A tall stick figure and a small one, both with disproportionately large hands. Cillian looked at it from across the table and felt something steady settle in his chest. By 4 o'clock, the Meridian Peak representatives had left the building. Their senior counsel had, in a 30-minute call, acknowledged that the absence of founding shareholder consent created material issues with the transaction that would require independent legal review before any further steps could proceed. That was the polished version of "the deal was dead." By 5 o'clock, Cillian had formally notified Preston Hale, Kevin Drummond, and Rosalind Vance's firm that he was initiating an independent audit of all financial reporting from the previous 18 months and retaining outside counsel to assess whether the shareholder amendment process had met the required standard of full disclosure. He made clear in writing, with Fergus on the phone and the national firm's partner copied, that until that review was complete, no executive decision-making authority on transactions, contracts, or shareholder matters was to be exercised without his direct written approval. Preston said very little during this portion. He had the look of a man who had been running a calculation in his head and had arrived at an answer he didn't like. Cillian did not fire everyone that afternoon. That wasn't how it worked, and it wouldn't have served anyone to pretend otherwise. What he did over the following 6 weeks was methodical and careful in the way that his approach to foundations had always been. You don't pull a wall down carelessly, because careless demolition damages what you're trying to keep. The audit confirmed what Dr. Ose had found, and found more besides. Kevin Drummond resigned on the 7th day of the audit process, before the findings were complete. He retained a lawyer. There are things that resignation cannot undo, and what followed, which involved both a civil claim and a referral to the relevant regulatory body, was a process that took months and did not resolve quietly. Rosalind Vance's firm withdrew from the matter within 2 weeks, citing a conflict of interest they had somehow not identified earlier. The Law Society of Alberta was made aware of certain matters pertaining to the retainer arrangement with the numbered company in New Brunswick. That process is ongoing. Preston Hale was terminated. The grounds were detailed and documented. He did not contest the termination, which suggested his own legal counsel had advised him that contest was inadvisable. He left the building on a Tuesday morning with 2 cardboard boxes and the particular kind of dignity that is actually just silence doing the work of dignity. The 2 directors who had participated in the closing meeting, without disclosing its nature to the founding shareholder, were asked to resign from the board. They did. The shareholder amendments were reviewed by a court on application and set aside on the grounds of inadequate disclosure. The original voting provisions were restored. Clause 31 of the founding agreement was, as it turned out, still exactly where it had always been. On page 31, in ordinary language, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The programs that Drummond had been quietly defunding, an apprenticeship partnership with a trades college in Medicine Hat, a worker safety initiative that had been categorized in the altered reports as a redundant expense, were reinstated. Cillian sat down with the managers who had been running those programs on diminishing resources and told them directly that he was sorry it had taken him this long to notice. Months later, on a cold Saturday in February, Cillian drove out to the project site where the first building he had ever personally worked on still stood. A modest warehouse extension in Red Deer, steel-framed and plain, nothing remarkable about it, except that his father had helped him pour the floor, and his uncle had signed the first check, and Catherine had brought sandwiches to the site on the second day and stayed most of the afternoon. Wren was in the back seat. She had brought Hazel. He didn't get out of the truck. He just sat there for a few minutes in the gray February light, looking at the building. It was still standing. That was the thing about structures built honestly, they tended to stay. Wren asked if that was the first building. He told her it was. She looked at it for a while. Then she said, "It's not that fancy." Cillian laughed. It was the first time in a long time that he laughed without anything underneath it. "No," he said, "it's not. But it's still there. It is." She leaned her chin on the back of his seat, looking at the warehouse in the gray afternoon. "That's the important part, right?" she said. "That it's still there." He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, her mother's eyes, her small hand resting near his shoulder. "Yeah," he said, "that's the important part." He drove them home.